Psalm 2, verse 2. You'll notice it's a lengthy verse, but there's a lot of really fascinating stuff. So even though this will be a longer video, hope you enjoy it. Let's read. Parestesen hoi basilestes ges, kai hoi archantes sunekthesan epita alta, kata tu kuriou kai, kata tu Christu altu, diapsalma. All right, well, let's start with the noun here. So we begin with the nominative plural of basileus, the kings, and it's the kings of the earth. So what are they doing? Parestesan, this is from paristemi, which means to stand by. With the son ending, epsilon here, this is a third plural aorist active indicative. So the kings of the earth have stood by, or something along those lines. And then notice, as we saw in verse 1, the next nominative, hoi archantes, which is the third declension with the es ending of archon, which is to be a ruler. So it's the rulers. We have a switch of order. So we had the noun here in second position after the verb in the first line. Now we have the noun in first position followed by the verb afterwards. And that again follows the Hebrew word order. And so the rulers, sunekthesan, this is a third plural aorist active indicative. Notice the thesan ending here from sunago, which means to gather together. And so the rulers have gathered together, epita alta. And as a reminder, whenever you have the neuter of the third person pronoun, altas, in this case it's the neuter from alta, it's going to be accusative because of the epi, with an article. And nothing else. It means the same. And so in this situation, they have gathered upon the same place. In other words, they're in the same location. Now, they're gathering and they're standing against two different persons here, kata and then kata. And so we have kata tu kuriou, which is translating the Hebrew against Yahweh here, or Adonai if you prefer, and then it's against to Christu altu, which is translating Mashiach, or his anointed one. So these rulers are standing against the Lord and against his Christ or Messiah. And this is a very important pairing between the Hebrew Mashiach and Christos in Greek, and you'll see that in many places in the Psalter, as well as some other situations as we move from the Hebrew to the Greek. That is, of course, very familiar language from the New Testament. This, of course, would be Christ in the New Testament, the anointed one, as a basic translation. So that's why, if you remember from the prior video, many early translators and scribes had the instinct that this is a sort of Davidic psalm in a certain sense, because it's already introducing the Messiah figure. So that's quite interesting. Then we have diapsalma, which is very odd here. If you're familiar with the Psalms, you'll often see a selah, or sometimes it'll be footnote in various ways, which is a way of rendering this word in Hebrew. And even to this day, there's not 100% consensus as to what that is. It is thought by many to be some sort of musical interlude. It's a pause, something like that. And in the Psalter, it typically gets translated with diapsalma, which is kind of a made-up word. You can see that psalm is kind of there. It's got a prepositional prefix. It doesn't really mean anything, or something like through song or something like that. However, this is the weird thing. There is no selah in Psalm 2. It's been added by the early Greek translator for some reason that really betrays explanation. There doesn't appear to be any underlying reason for it in the Hebrew tradition. So maybe they're mimicking future psalms. I don't exactly know, but I find that to be quite fascinating. Last thing I'll mention, though, is that this psalm, actually Psalm 2, 1 and 2, is quoted in a very, very interesting way in the book of Acts, where Peter says this, who through, this is talking about God, through the mouth of our father David, so he takes this psalm to be a psalm of David, your servant said by the Holy Spirit. So according to Peter, the psalms are written by inspiration of the Holy Spirit. That's an important point, but not the main one I'm making. And then he goes on to quote from Psalm 2, verses 1 and 2 that we've seen. Why did the Gentiles, notice in most translations will now take that as Gentiles as opposed to nations, which would be the more appropriate way to translate it in the ancient form, the original psalm, because Gentiles weren't really, that's not really the language we're talking back then. Why did the Gentiles rage and the peoples plot in vain? So that was Psalm 2:1. The kings of the earth set themselves or are standing, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and against his anointed. So that's how you could translate it from the New Testament side. It's pretty close to the Greek that we've looked at. And so Peter here is directly quoting what we've just worked on. But here's what I find to be quite fascinating. He says, truly in this city they were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus. So he is now identifying Jesus, notice the use of gathering together, as this anointed one. So he is making a very clear Christological application of Psalm 2:2. Whom you anointed, there's the anointed language. And then he says both Herod and Pontius Pilate. And then he mentions the Gentiles, which comes from the psalm, and the peoples of Israel, which also comes from the psalm. And so he basically says, look, when Jesus was put on trial, you actually have Psalm 2:2 being fulfilled. Herod represents the peoples of Israel. It's actually kind of chiastic here. Pontius Pilate, the Roman procurator, represents the Gentiles. They're both gathered against the Lord and his anointed one. And what's further interesting about that, Luke being the writer of the book of Acts here, is that Luke's gospel alone mentions the trial before Herod. The other gospels don't mention that directly. And so there's a lot of interesting ways in which you have this deep connection back to Psalm 2, specifically in the sort of Luke-Acts tradition, as they expound on this psalm as being directly fulfilled, really in every possible way. Not just the use of anointed language, although that's important, the Christ here, but even the pair of people who were there, the Gentile sort of half and the Jewish half. So a lot of really interesting stuff. It's a long video, but hopefully this has been fun.